This week's Sacred Interview is a co-production with Larger Us featuring Daryl Davis, who's an amazing African-American blues musician who has spent much of his life being in conversation with, dialogue with, even friendship with members of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations, and thereby persuading many of them to leave said organizations. But it was an audio-only episode. So we don't have a video for you here today. What you're going to see in a moment is my reflection on the episode. Hopefully it will be full of useful bits and bobs, even if you haven't yet heard it. But if you prefer to listen first, head on over to our podcast feed and check it out there. Wow. What a lovely man. What a lovely combination of sort of lightheartedness, actually, and moral seriousness. The first thing I'm reflecting on is how his childhood away from the United States has made his work possible. I think that it was reminding me of an interview I did with Tomowa Oluwade, who is a writer. He wrote a book called This Is Not America, and he's a Black man who grew up in Africa, in Nigeria, I believe, before moving to the UK. And he talks about when you grow up in a majority Black environment, being a Black person is not a salient part of your identity because everyone's Black, you're just a person, and how that shaped his thinking about race. And Daryl, many of the postings that his dad had, he was in the security services, was in Africa. He spent the majority of the time on those postings in his childhood in Africa. And he therefore grew up in kind of Black majority countries. And also, as he said, with the children of diplomats, right? People from all over the world. And therefore his Blackness was not, his experience of that was very different than if perhaps he'd grown up in the US as a minority. And I wonder how much that has enabled him to do the work he does, right? How that slightly changed his script. That, you know, he told that story about not believing his parents that racism existed because it seemed so illogical and irrational to him. And I love how his response was curiosity. You know, well, I just have to answer that question because it's clearly so ridiculous. He received it at an age where it seemed possible for him not to internalize it, not to take on some of that sense of inferiority that the racist culture around him was trying to tell about him, but also neither kind of reject it with anger, which would have been entirely understandable, but just to be curious about it. I love curiosity as a posture. I think it's such a beautiful, wonderful thing. I first started thinking about it seriously in a book by Elizabeth Gilbert called Big Magic, about creativity, about following your curiosity as a key thing in living a creative life. But when we demonstrate curiosity towards other people, there's an inherent humility to it because we're assuming we don't know everything. We're assuming that there's something for us to learn. And it requires us to listen in order to find out, right? This first step, Daryl didn't set out to make friends with Klan's people. He set out to answer a question. And in order to do that, he had to listen. And in listening, a relationship was formed. You know, and he listened for a long time before these white supremacists ever asked him a question back. But they did eventually. And in so doing, he began to shift their perceptions. He began to shift their reality. I wrote a Substack piece a little while ago called Friendship is My Theory of Change. And it really is our ability to approach each other as potential friends, to listen with curiosity, to seek out relationship before we try and accuse or blame or reject. And there's a phrase I use from a parenting expert called Dr. Laura Markham, which is connect before you correct. And I think the same holds true of almost everything. It's reminding me of of James Martin, who said this quote from the Pope, affective collegiality precedes effective collegiality. Essentially, you have to have some sort of emotional connection before you can hope to change someone's mind. And Daryl is doing that par excellence. And as he was talking, he said a couple of things that was really reminding me of this particular psychological insight I've been sitting with recently. He said, when you're attacking someone's reality, you're attacking them. And that the people who talked about a particular story about what a black man was like, and then he came in and messed up that story because he was clever and smart and trustworthy and honest, right? And there is a model of cognition called predictive processing, which is, I'm no expert, but I gather is fairly well attested. And it's this idea that the brain is constantly throwing out guesses about what the world is like, predictions, kind of working models. Stereotypes is one of them, right? But about everything, it's really exhausting for us to be taking in all of the messages that the world is sending us through our senses and sorting through them and sifting through them all the time. So instead, the theory goes that our brain comes up with guesses, and then when we, I'm struggling to resist the machine language in this because I'm a little bit resistant to machine language, but it's very embedded in the model. So I'm just going to have to surrender to it for the minute. When we get error messages, basically when our model clashes with something that we encounter in the world, for example, when the Klansman's model of a black man turns out not to be correct, there's two things we can do with that. We can reject it, which people often do, that we can go through all kinds of lengths to protect our model, to get the sense that we're right. This is cognitive dissonance, I believe, is what's happening in this moment. Or we can allow our mental model to change and expand and our horizons to open up, and we can learn something about the world or about the person in front of us. But that takes a lot more energy. I also think it takes a lot more courage because it requires us acknowledging that we were wrong, which is why starting from curiosity is so helpful. And that moment when someone's model is changing, when their guess about the world is being shown, as it always will be, to be faulty and partial, says a lot about someone's character. And it's very easy to feel destabilized and fearful when your mental model of the world is shown to be false. And I think it seems like what Daryl is amazingly able to do is almost pastor people through it. He's actually a Christian. He's talked about it in various places, although he doesn't talk about it a lot. I wonder if it's part of what is it makes him able to do this work. But he's able to stay with someone while they go through this very destabilizing thing of changing their understanding of what a black person is, and therefore eventually changing their whole belonging, right? Leaving these organizations which have built communities around believing that black people are inferior. And so I wonder if you recognize in yourself that you have mental models or stereotypes or assumptions or prejudices about certain people and groups. It's really hard to catch ourselves in this, but if you notice when something comes in that messes with your model, whether you're able to pastor yourself, I guess, hold yourself steady through that moment and allow your horizons to expand. It's one of the nicest bits of feedback we've had on The Sacred recently, is someone said, "You mess with all my would-be tidy assumptions." And I hate that I need that, but I do. And I kind of want to say back to that listener, we all do. Don't worry, we all do. And those of us like Daryl who can develop the courage to help people in that moment, to be sufficiently present and calm and steady as someone allows their mind and their heart to change on something, is a very beautiful thing. I wonder if it's the only way anyone really changes on these deep things. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and our production team are Dan Turner, Amari Ugandrian, and Lizzie Harvey. This is a project of the think tank Theos. Please do check out our wider work. There is an amazing new animation by my colleague Emily Down about sleep and rest, and it is absolutely gorgeous, and I would highly recommend going to check it out. It's called In Sync with the Sun. Otherwise, this is the last interview episode of this series. I will be back with a reflection quite shortly. But for now, thank you so much for listening. And as always, please do get in touch and tell me what you thought. Speak to you soon.